The day I watched more than 100 furious strangers march up a narrow mountain road toward my cabin, chanting my name like a curse, I knew something was very wrong. This wasn't a prank, and it definitely wasn't coincidence. It was a full-blown protest, organized, loud, and aimed directly at me. I stood on my porch, coffee shaking in my hand, trying to understand how a quiet weekend retreat had turned into a battleground. The banners accused me of stealing land, breaking rules, and disrespecting a community I had never joined. That was the moment I realized the HOA had decided to make me their villain. My cabin sits high above the tree line, miles from the nearest town, a place I bought specifically to escape noise, politics, and petty authority. There is no gate, no shared road, no clubhouse, and absolutely no homeowners association tied to my deed. I checked that detail 3 times before signing. Yet somehow, overnight, I became public enemy number 1. According to the flyers taped to rocks along my driveway, I was refusing to pay fees, ignoring community rules, and threatening property values. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter once the crowd arrived. As the protesters closed in, I could hear shouting echo off the cliffs, anger amplifying with every step they took upward. Some held phones, filming, hoping for a confrontation. Others rang cowbells, a strange choice that still sends chills through me. I tried explaining, calmly at first, that I wasn't part of their HOA. My words were swallowed by noise. One man screamed that I was lying. Another demanded I come down and face them. That's when fear replaced confusion. I locked my door, grabbed my documents, and called the police, unsure whether they would even reach me in time. The HOA had crossed a line, and they were about to learn what happens when you weaponize a mob against the wrong person. I had no idea this confrontation was only the opening scene of a much larger fight, one that would involve lawyers, sheriff deputies, property records, and a board so arrogant they believed intimidation was law. That morning taught me how quickly misinformation spreads when authority figures encourage outrage. It also taught me that silence can be dangerous. Standing alone on that mountain, listening to threats bounce through thin air, I understood something important. This story wasn't just about a cabin. It was about power, boundaries, and what happens when ordinary people forget who actually has legal authority. The worst part was knowing the HOA believed they were untouchable, convinced fear would make me surrender without resistance. They were about to be very wrong. The police arrived faster than I expected, sirens echoing through the trees like a warning shot. 2 patrol cars climbed the mountain road, forcing the protesters to scatter and step back. The crowd didn't disappear, though. They lingered, filming, shouting accusations, convinced the officers were there to pressure me into compliance. Instead, the first thing the deputy asked was simple. "Are you part of their HOA?" I handed him my deed, the survey map, and the purchase agreement I kept ready for exactly this kind of madness. As he read, his expression changed. The confidence drained from the protesters when they saw him nod. He walked straight to the self-appointed HOA leader, a woman with a megaphone who had been directing chants like a general. He asked her to explain why she had organized a demonstration on private property against someone with no legal obligation to her association. She stuttered, then claimed my land was historically part of the community and that I was benefiting from shared amenities. The deputy asked her to name a single amenity I used. She couldn't. That's when the situation flipped. The officers announced that the gathering was unlawful, that my property was not under HOA jurisdiction, and that continued harassment could result in citations or arrests. The crowd reacted with disbelief. Some argued. Others shouted that the cops were corrupt. A few quietly backed away, realizing they had been dragged into something illegal. Phones lowered. Voices softened. The HOA leader tried one last tactic, claiming I was blocking a community emergency access route. I watched the deputy pull out his tablet and check county records in real time. He shook his head and said the road was privately maintained, with an easement that did not include protest activity. That statement ended the debate. One officer stayed with me, while the others ordered the protesters to leave the mountain entirely. As the crowd retreated downhill, anger turned into embarrassment. People avoided eye contact. A few apologized under their breath. The woman with the megaphone left last, promising loudly that this wasn't over. The deputy overheard, and calmly told her that any further attempts to intimidate me would be documented as harassment. When the noise finally faded, the silence felt unreal. I thanked the officers, but they weren't done yet. One of them warned me that HOAs sometimes escalate after losing face. He suggested I file an official incident report and prepare for follow-up actions. That advice proved critical. Standing there alone again, I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate strategy. The HOA had assumed fear would override facts. They expected me to fold when confronted by numbers. Instead, they exposed themselves. And now that law enforcement was involved, every move they made would be on record. The mountain was quiet again, but the conflict had only shifted into a more dangerous phase. The next morning, I woke up to a dozen missed calls, all from numbers I didn't recognize. Voicemails followed, each more aggressive than the last. Some accused me of humiliating the community. Others demanded I do the right thing and pay fees I never owed. One message warned that protests were only the beginning. That was when I understood. The HOA wasn't embarrassed. They were angry. Losing control in public had wounded their pride, and pride makes people reckless. I drove down the mountain to the county recorder's office with a folder under my arm. Inside were copies of my deed, survey lines, tax records, and the original listing that clearly stated my cabin was outside any HOA boundary. The clerk barely needed 5 minutes to confirm it. She stamped certified copies, slid them across the counter, and told me quietly that I wasn't the first person to come in with HOA trouble that month. That sentence stuck with me. On the way back, I stopped by the sheriff's department to file the incident report the deputy had suggested. I detailed everything: the flyers, the chants, the threats, and the organizer's name. The officer, taking my statement, raised his eyebrows when I mentioned over 100 people. He told me something I didn't expect. Organizing a mass confrontation on private property can cross from civil dispute into criminal behavior, especially when intimidation is involved. Hearing that shifted something in me. This wasn't just annoying anymore. It was dangerous. That afternoon, a certified letter arrived at my cabin, as if on cue. The HOA formally demanded compliance, fees, and retroactive penalties, citing rules that didn't apply to my land. The letter ended with a warning about community enforcement actions. Laughed at first, then stopped. The wording was threatening by design. They were daring me to respond emotionally. I didn't. Instead, I scanned everything and forwarded it to a property attorney recommended by the sheriff's office. By evening, the attorney called me back. After reviewing the documents, he said the HOA had no authority over my property and had likely exposed themselves to liability. Sending protesters, false claims, and threatening letters could qualify as harassment and defamation. His advice was clear: do not engage directly, document everything, and let legal pressure replace emotional reactions. That night, I sat on my porch again, looking down the same road the protesters had marched up. It felt different now. I wasn't confused or scared anymore. I was focused. The HOA believed they could rewrite reality by being louder than everyone else. What they didn't realize was that every threat, every lie, and every organized act against me was building. A case they couldn't chant their way out of. The mountain was quiet, but something was coming. 2 days later, the HOA made their biggest mistake yet. They escalated in writing. Another certified letter arrived, this time copying a private security company and threatening to enforce compliance, physically if necessary. The wording was clumsy, emotional, and reckless. When I read it, my attorney didn't even sound angry. He sounded satisfied. He told me this letter crossed a bright red legal line. An HOA threatening physical enforcement against a non-member on private land wasn't just harassment anymore. It was evidence. Within hours, my attorney drafted a formal cease and desist letter, citing county records, state statutes, and the incident report number from the sheriff's department. It demanded the HOA stop all contact immediately, retract false claims, and preserve all communications related to my property. It also warned that further action would result in a civil lawsuit naming individual board members personally, not just the association. That detail mattered. People get brave behind titles, but they panic when their own assets are on the line. The response was immediate and chaotic. Emails started flying, some apologetic, others defensive. One board member tried to claim the protest had been community-driven, not HOA organized. Screenshots from their own group chat proved otherwise. Another insisted the road was communal, despite county maps saying the opposite. Every contradiction made them look worse. Then the sheriff showed up again, unannounced. He told me the HOA president had called to complain about legal intimidation. The irony was almost funny. He assured me they had been warned explicitly not to contact or approach me again. Any violation would be treated as harassment. He also mentioned something else that caught my attention. Several protesters had filed complaints of their own, claiming they were misled about the situation and pressured to participate. The mob was starting to turn on its organizer. By the end of the week, the HOA's public narrative collapsed. Their online posts disappeared. Flyers vanished from town boards. The megaphone woman deleted her account entirely. Silence replaced outrage. My attorney advised patience. Legal consequences move slower than mobs, but they hit harder. Sitting inside my cabin that night, I reflected on how quickly authority can become abuse when unchecked. The HOA wasn't protecting a community. They were protecting control. They assumed I'd pay just to make them go away. Instead, they taught everyone watching a lesson about limits. What they didn't know yet was that consequences were already in motion behind the scenes. Insurance carriers had been notified. Legal exposure had been calculated, and the people who once shouted my name in anger were now asking questions about who lied to them. The HOA thought this fight was about dues. They were about to learn it was about accountability. The final shift happened quietly, without protests or threats. It came in the form of another certified envelope, but this one felt different the moment I picked it up. Inside was a formal retraction. The HOA acknowledged, in carefully crafted legal language, that my property was not subject to their authority and that prior communications had been issued in error. There was no apology, but there was something better. Surrender. They agreed to cease all contact and confirmed they would notify members that I was not, and never had been, part of the association. My attorney smiled when I read it to him over the phone. He explained that this wasn't goodwill. It was damage control. Their insurance carrier had likely stepped in after reviewing the threats, police involvement, and documentation. Once insurers see the word harassment tied to organized actions, they don't negotiate. They instruct retreat. The HOA hadn't suddenly grown ethical. They had grown scared. A week later, I noticed something else. Cars slowed as they passed my road, but no one stopped. The town gossip mill had turned. People who once believed the flyers now knew the truth. A few even waved. One afternoon, a man from the protest hiked up alone and apologized. He said he'd been told I was blocking shared land and refusing emergency access. When he saw the maps online, he realized he'd been manipulated. That moment mattered more to me than any letter. The sheriff closed the incident report with a note stating no further action was required unless the HOA violated the cease and desist. That line felt like closure. The mountain returned to what it had always been. Quiet, indifferent, and solid. No chants, no cowbells. Just wind through trees and the occasional bird cutting across the sky. Looking back, the most disturbing part wasn't the protest itself. It was how easily authority figures convinced ordinary people to act aggressively, without verifying facts. The HOA relied on volume, fear, and assumed compliance. When those failed, they folded. I still keep my documents ready, not because I expect trouble, but because I learned something valuable. Peace isn't maintained by silence. It's maintained by boundaries. My cabin stands exactly where it always did. Untouched, ungoverned, and finally respected. This story didn't end with revenge or victory speeches. It ended with accountability and quiet. And honestly, that's the best ending I could have asked for.